Rancher lived alone for years until the Bigfoot returned his childhood toy. Before we begin, take a moment to comment your city. Where are you watching from today? And once the story is over, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. The night wind swept across the prairie, roaring through the dry grass hills. Somewhere in the dark, the low cry of a harmonica drifted like a memory, blending with the faint rhythm of distant hoofbeats pounding against the cracked earth. Red dust rose from the trail that wound its way to a lonely ranch where pale moonlight stretched across a weathered wooden roof. Midnight, the horse grew restless, snorting, pawing at the hard ground with sharp hooves. Elias Ward pushed open the door and stepped onto the porch, his breath mingling with the cold mist of night. Then he froze. There, beneath the faded boards of the old porch, lay something small and still, a broken, dust-covered toy wagon. The very same wooden plaything he had lost as a boy. Elias's hand trembled as his fingers brushed against it. And in that instant, memory struck him like a wild wind, tearing down from the mountains, memories long buried, now rushing back with a force that stole the breath from his chest. The lonely man. The wind came sweeping down from the far-off mountains, carrying with it the cold breath of the Wyoming highlands. Under the night sky, the moon spilled its silver light across withered hills of grass, stretching so far that the horizon itself seemed to vanish. In that vast emptiness stood a weathered ranch house, its roof faded, its walls cracked by years of storms and sand. Only a single oil lamp glowed faintly through the window, a small flame pushing back against the endless dark. Inside, Elias Ward sat motionless in a creaking wooden chair. A man past 40, broad-shouldered, his hands calloused from ranch work, yet his eyes were heavy, the kind that had looked too long upon loss. On the table before him lay a faded photograph of his late wife, her smile now living only in memory. His rough fingers traced the edge of the frame, pausing on a small crack in the glass, as though it were the very fault line of his heart. The cabin was hollow, filled only with the whisper of fire in the stove and the mournful wind clawing at the walls. Out here in the west, where men were gunslingers and wanderers along dusty trails, Elias had chosen a different path, one of shadows hidden from town, from laughter, from faith itself. And in the dim flicker of lamplight, his silhouette stretched across the wall, a lonely shadow that seemed to pose a question to anyone listening in the quiet. If you were living alone on a ranch like this, what would you do? Part 1. Echoes of the Past. The wind swept down from the black ridges, rushing across the prairie, rattling the dry grass like an old coat twisted in a weary hand. Above, the sky opened into a cavernous night where the moon hung low like a bitten silver coin. Elias Ward's ranch crouched in that emptiness, a roof bleached by sun walls carved by sandstorms, a lopsided horse barn and a windmill creaking like an old man turning in restless sleep. Inside, an oil lamp breathed a dull yellow glow. Elias sat motionless at the table, his elbows resting on the scarred, wood-calloused hands, cradling a faded picture frame. A man past 40, shoulders broad and wrists thick from ranch work, yet there was a strange gentleness in his eyes, the kind of gentleness that comes to a man only after he's lost enough to stop wanting to hurt anyone ever again. His rough thumb traced a hairline crack across the glass. In the photo, a woman smiled not toward the camera, but as if she were looking through it across years straight into where Elias sat tonight. Outside, the cattle knocked horns against the rails, their heavy flanks shifting like waves. Leather creaked. Midnight, his black stallion snorted into the dark. Then a gunshot echoed from the distance, sharp, flat, and gone like a stone pitched into a dry well. Elias lifted his head. Out here, a gunshot wasn't always trouble. Sometimes it was just a traveler's greeting. Sometimes it was a lonely cowboy's call for company. And sometimes it was the sound of trouble coming off the desert trail. He didn't rise. He only breathed the sound, heavy as old boards groaning. Wind threaded through the gaps in the walls, and its whistle turned into something like a harmonica, half-played, broken, stumbling. It sounded just like his life since the winter sickness had stolen his wife from this house. And there, between the long sigh of wind and that short bark of gunfire, Elias felt himself small again, like a boy left behind in some cold church, waiting at the window for someone who would never return. He set the frame down. On the table beside his cold coffee sat the wooden toy wagon he had found on the porch beneath the moon, its wheels still clotted with red dust. He couldn't explain why it had returned tonight of all nights after so many years. But one thing was certain: the silence inside him had shifted. It felt less bitter, less sharp, like someone had laid a thin wool blanket across his chest. Elias touched the toy wheel smooth beneath his finger, and for a flicker of a moment, childhood swam up from the dark like a small fish before vanishing again. Out in the yard, midnight shook his mane and struck the ground. Elias whispered just enough for himself. "There's still room here. For a breath." Then he rose, lifted the lamp, and stepped onto the porch. His shadow stretched thin across the planks, as fragile as smoke. The West had never been gentle at night, but tonight it wasn't cruel either. It was simply wide. And in that wideness, every sound became an echo. The shot in the distance, the cattle's breath, the long pull of wind, and the tired beat of one man's heart. Before dawn, the air already smelled of heat. The wind shifted, carrying fine grit like sifted ash. Elias bolted the barn, pulled his hat low, shrugged into his coat, and led Midnight out. The ground crunched like brittle sugar beneath their boots. Dust stretched in a faint ribbon down the trail, the kind that carried hoofprints and sometimes the dragging line of a wagon hauling the sick. He walked the fence line, replacing rotten posts, tightening sagging wire. The herd grew restless. On the horizon, low clouds massed black as bison flashes of white flickering inside them, a sure sign of the season's first sandstorm. Elias wasn't one to ask for help. He swung into the saddle legs, clamping against Midnight's flanks, and spurred into the herd. His whistle cut through the air, his whip cracked, and the prairie itself seemed to wake. The storm hit sudden. Wind-veered dust rose. The world turned into a hide of leather pulled taut before his eyes. The herd broke, circling in panic, smashing into rails. A bull slammed sideways, wild-eyed. Elias leaned low, steering Midnight into a hard arc, forcing the cattle in tighter. His voice roared against the storm gravel rough, while Midnight's shoulders heaved like pistons beneath him. Then a gunshot. Closer this time. It pinned the storm with its weight, sharp as a nail through hide. Elias twisted, squinting through the dust. On a ridge far off, a dark shape rose, jerked, and vanished. Someone was shooting, but at what? In the West, a gun carried its own law. It found your ears, then sank into your gut, pulling invisible strings. For Elias, it plucked an old cord. Another storm, another gunshot years ago, the night he and his wife had waited out, the wind listening for a knock at the door that never came. The dust thickened. A calf lay tangled in wire, its legs thrashing. Elias vaulted down, dropped to a knee, hands burning as he freed it. Sand scoured his neck like fire. The calf gasped wide-eyed, then bolted toward its mother. Elias straightened, and through the choking veil he saw the far fence shudder. A rail snapped, split clean, as though something heavy, too heavy for cattle, had smashed through. He ran, Midnight close behind. At the break, he crouched, low palm pressing into the dirt. The impression was broad, deep oval. Not hoof, not wheel, something else. Something heavy padded wrong. The storm clawed at his hat, tugged gray strands loose at his temple. Elias said nothing. He lashed the gap shut with rope, drove the herd into a safer corner, worked until the dust thinned and his lungs burned. His hands shook from weariness, yet deep in his chest, another trembling stirred, not fear, but gratitude. Gratitude for work still left to do, for beasts to tend, for fences to mend. Solitude, when filled with labor, found itself a place to stand. By evening, Elias rode Midnight into town for salt and nails. The trail ran like a rope across the prairie, over stone humps, dropping into a dust-choked hollow, where two rows of wooden buildings faced each other like broken teeth. On the saloon's porch, a man played harmonica, the tune a poor cousin of those old trail songs sung around firelight. Elias tied Midnight at the general store. Inside, flour dust mingled with lamp oil and fresh pine boards. He kept his hat on, spoke little, handed over his list. The storekeeper glanced, nodded, and fetched the goods. The others watched Elias the way men watch a rock lodged in a river, not strange, not familiar, just in the way. In the West, eyes did more than look. They measured. They accused. At the counter, a young gunman with silver inlaid on his Colt leaned and whispered something to a red-haired friend. Both chuckled. Rumor had traveled ahead, strange shadows seen near the tree line, strange pounding against the barns at night. "The monster's out there again," someone muttered. Elias didn't flinch at the word monster. He packed his nails, tucked the salt under his arm, paid exact, said nothing more. As he turned, he glimpsed through the doorframe a woman hurrying across the street, a child in her arms. The little one laughed, swinging a wooden toy wheel tied to a string. That sight cut straight through him, the image of the wagon wheel lying on his own table, flashing sharp and sudden. The young gunman sneered. Old man Ward, still living alone, burning those lamps all night, or just waiting for that monster to bring back your toys? The redhead laughed. The storekeeper cleared his throat, a warning, but said no more. Elias stood still a moment. Then he settled his hat, turned, and walked out without a single word. On the porch, the harmonica shifted its tune. The notes sagged sad as sunset fading. Elias laid a hand on Midnight's neck. The stallion lifted its eyes, exhaling warm breath into the cooling air. The prairie beyond was folding the last of its golden light into the dirt. Elias tied down his supplies, swung into the saddle. For a heartbeat, he felt the weight of a gaze, not from any man, but from some other window in some other world. He turned. Nothing but the glass of the general store, throwing back the image of a broad-shouldered figure, hat brim, low gait, uneven with the weariness of a long day. He left town in the same silence he had carried in, and carried out. Night stepped back onto the prairie with quiet, grass-woven feet. The moon climbed higher, silvering the spine of Midnight's back. Elias checked the fence once more. The wind no longer carried dust, but a new scent, damp moss-stone water, the earth-heavy breath of something that had passed by, something that walked with the weight of mountains. The herd stirred awake. Calves called to their mothers, the mothers answering slow and low. Something brushed against the feed barrel by the barn, knocking soft, unhurried. Elias lifted the lantern. Its light swayed, painting a golden ring across the post. He moved around the back of the barn. At the edge of the yard where the fence had been patched with fresh rope, the soil still soft, a trail of impressions remained. Each print was round oval, pressed deep with ridges along the edges like the mark of a hand, too large, too jointed, pressed down and lifted again. He crouched, tracing one groove with his finger, his tongue pressed against a back tooth, a habit from years past when weighing out decisions. On a fence post nearby, a dark streak glistened, sap still tacky. A thread of bark had been torn away. No scent of iron, no scent of blood. Somewhere in the trees, faint knocking began, tap, 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 deliberate, steady. Not hooves, not hammer. More like someone tapping an old stick against a hollow trunk, keeping rhythm. Elias straightened, blew the lantern out. Night rushed in and swallowed all light. He let his eyes adjust to the dark. Then he heard it breathing, soft, even. The kind of breathing hunters knew, the kind of breath a traveler carried after miles through stone canyons. Sometimes, too, it was the sound made by creatures not found in any man's ledger. Midnight snorted, stepped forward, head-tilting, ears pricked toward the forest. Elias laid a calming hand on the horse's neck, his palm moving in quiet rhythm. There was no malice in the air, only presence. A being was there as plain as the scent of pine pitch and horseflesh. He didn't call out, didn't draw his gun. He stood still, letting the night move through him like water through cloth, letting the knocking continue a while before it faded away. When silence returned, Elias went back to the porch. He lifted the toy wagon from the table. It was heavier than memory. He set it down lengthwise as though laying a question flat upon the wood. In the slant of moonlight through the window, that little thing seemed loyal like an old hound that would not leave its master's feet, weary yet faithful. Elias's throat tightened, not with the thirst of desert, but with the thirst of a voice unspoken. Still he said nothing. He sat listening to his heartbeat and to the long years beating with it. By dawn, mist rolled up from the hollow, beating the porch boards in silver drops. The fire in the hearth had died, leaving 4 embers glowing red like watchful eyes. Elias leaned an elbow on the table, setting the frame beside the wooden wagon. One bore absence of a person, the other absence of time, yet side by side they made the house feel less empty. In his mind, he was 7 again, running through thickets with the wagon bouncing behind rope clutched in a small hand. The sky that day was blue, the earth warm, and his mother laughing. Then came a shadow, not man, not beast, but a presence. He remembered the wind in the leaves, the hammering of his heart, the wagon slipping from his fingers. He never remembered where it fell. Only that winter came after, and more winters after that. The toy never returned. Until tonight. Elias touched the photo frame like asking leave. Then he touched the wagon wheel like offering thanks. If some being had kept this trifle through countless snows, if it had known to return it upon this porch beneath this moon, then maybe, just maybe, the world was not as emptied out as he had thought. Outside, wind combed the prairie smooth again, laying bare faint tracks like the earth's own fingerprints. The cattle chewed cud stubbornly, peaceful. Midnight nosed at the doorway, pushing the wood with his brow exhaling warmth. Just that gesture was enough to tell Elias he was not altogether alone. He rose while the sky was still a thin ribbon of violet. Carrying the wagon, he set it upon the sill where the first light touched. The sun had not yet risen, but dawn's honey glow already filled the wooden wheel. Elias leaned against the doorframe, his body resting heavy on his legs, as though promising himself the simplest of things. Today he would walk the fence line hammer, a nail boil coffee fresh, and comb midnight's mane. And maybe tonight he would leave the door unlatched. Dew dampened the brim of his hat. Birds trilled briefly on the fence rails. From the far timber came another faint tap, tap, fading like a wordless farewell. Warmth spread in Elias's chest, not from coffee, but from the quiet sense of companionship, however strange the shape of it. He smiled so slight, only his muscles knew it. And then, as all men of the West must do once their smile has passed, he rolled up his sleeves. The day ahead would be long, but now it carried a small, bright ember hidden in its pocket. And if you had ever lived alone on a ranch like this, with wind that burns dust, that blinds gunshots from afar, and now and then a memory laid carefully on your porch, what would you do? Part 2. Uneasy in the night. The moon had just climbed over the ridge, spilling its cold light across the prairie. Inside the barn, Midnight grew restless, his nostrils flaring, his eyes bloodshot and catching the flicker of the oil lamp. His high, frantic whinny split the night, shaking the darkness closer as his hooves struck the ground in sharp, drum-like bursts. Elias jerked awake from his chair, hand reaching instinctively for the revolver hanging by the door. The weapon, worn smooth with years, carried the weight of time in its steel, and it felt heavy against his palm. His heartbeat thudded hard, uneven like the rhythm of the years he had lived alone, sometimes pounding, sometimes silent enough to suffocate. He stepped onto the porch. The cold wind slapped against his cheek. The barn was only a stone's throw away, yet tonight it looked foreign, the shadows too deep, the distance too long. Midnight's tail lashed chains clinking against wood. Elias moved quietly through the brittle grass, the moon drawing his shadow long and thin like a wanderer swallowed by the vast earth. The air carried scents, pine pitch, horsehide, and something else. Thick, damp, the smell of ground breathing after rain. Elias gripped the gun tighter, his eyes fixed on the barn door. Midnight stomped the planks, head raised, ears forward, gaze locked on the far fence line. Elias eased the door open, the hinges creaking. The stallion's eyes stayed fixed on the pasture. Elias followed the line of that stare. The moon had dropped low, silvering the grass. And there along the fence, something moved. A shadow, heavy, slow, like a boulder walking upright. He held his breath. The revolver was firm in his grip, but something inside his chest pulled back. No howl of wolf, no growl of bear, only the wind threading through branches and his own heartbeat hammering against bone. He stepped closer, shadow merging with the barns. Dust trickled from the eaves, the wind moaning a half-finished tune. Then another gunshot, distant, cold, echoing through the valley. Midnight shrieked, thrashing. Elias raised his revolver finger, hovering on the trigger. But in that instant, a thought pierced him. Would my bullet change anything, or would it only echo back another sound born from fear unnamed? Before he could decide, the wind shifted. A small storm ripped across the yard, red dust swirling, clawing at his face. The herd outside bawled in panic, hooves thundering into chaos, the fence rattling under their weight. Elias broke from the barn gun in hand, the gale stinging tears into his eyes. His shout tore out hoarse, "Yah, back in!" He loosed Midnight, and the stallion charged beside him, hooves pounding the dry earth. Through the storm's veil, Elias glimpsed them, a pair of eyes at the tree line. Not fire, not wolf, but a glow steady and deep like the surface of a midnight lake. He blinked, and the dust swept them away, leaving only emptiness aching in its place. That was the wound of the night fear, yes, but twined with wonder. As if an invisible hand had reached into his chest, tugging up a memory buried too deep to name. By morning, Elias rode into town. Sunlight sifted through the haze, painting every roof in muted shadow. In the saloon, voices hummed with talk. Anybody hear the knocking in the woods last night? Had to be it. Bigfoot. A young cowboy smirked. If old Ward's still breathing, then the monster must have only been playing with him. The sneer landed sharp and arrow, without a head, yet heavy enough to sink deep. Elias said nothing. He sat in the corner, the lonely notes of a harmonica drifting in from the porch, thin, broken, as mournful as prairie wind. He remembered the eyes from the night before. They had not carried malice, but he knew well here in town anything different was a threat. What they could not name, they would call a monster. And there was the true weight of it, a man carrying the truth in silence, hemmed in on every side by the judgment of others. Night fell again. Elias returned to the ranch, his revolver lying on the table, his hand never far from it. Midnight twitched tail, flicking ears forever tipped toward the woods. He sat by the window. The photograph of his wife and the old wooden toy wagon rested side by side. Wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, carrying faint, irregular knocks, like something tapping out a rhythm far away. Elias closed his eyes. His heartbeat slowed, but the unease clung heavy as the dust left after storms. Something was out there, not hostile, not friendly, only present, waiting for him to open his heart, or waiting for him to fire first. He sighed, whispering into the silence, "Maybe it's fear that's kept me alive. Or maybe it's the very thing burying me." Part 3. The Returned Toy. The night after the storm lay still, scented with damp earth and wild grass. Elias stepped onto the porch, lantern in hand, its flame weak and trembling in the draft. The moon rode high, bright enough that every crack in the porch boards showed clear, sharp as veins in a palm. And there, set square in the silver glow, lay something small, silent. Elias froze. It was a wooden wagon, crooked, worn, wrapped in a film of dust. His body jolted as if struck. The shape was too familiar, sharp as an ache in the chest. The lantern cast its quiver over it, revealing one wheel, chipped, the other greened with moss. Elias dropped to his knees, hand trembling as he reached for the wood. What met his fingers was not the present, but 40 years gone, fresh pine sap, a boy's laughter, the warmth of his mother's guiding hand. In the West, where bullets and sandstorms carved the law, a broken toy could still bring a man to his knees. The wind sighed down from the mountains, carrying faint echoes, a rush of young hooves, the crack of rifles, the prairie, as it had been long ago. Elias closed his eyes, and the years folded back. He was a boy again, tugging the wagon with a bit of string along the forest's edge. A gunshot cracked from far off the herd, stampeded dust rising thick. Out of the corner of his eye, a huge shadow moved. Fear yanked him forward. He ran. The rope slipped from his hand. The wagon rolled into dry leaves and was gone. He had wept that night, but his father barked, "What's lost is lost, boy. Only land holds its worth." His mother held him close, but the wagon never came back. Until tonight. Elias lifted it to eye level. Dust filmed its sides, but there on the wood remained the childish carving he had once scraped with his pocket knife, the first letter of his name, E. His throat tightened. From the barn came Midnight's steady whicker, not uneasy this time, but calm, almost solemn, as though the horse too felt the weight of this return. 40 years, Elias whispered, voice raw. Who's been keeping you all this time? A breeze rattled the porch beams, creaking like an answer. From deep in the timber came the faint, steady tap. Tap, tap. Not hurried, not threatening, just present. Elias stiffened, heart hammering. The prairie night was no longer empty. It brimmed with something unseen, strange, yet near. The next day he carried the wagon into town tucked into his coat pocket. He had no wish to boast, only to know he hadn't dreamed. But at the saloon bar, as he set down his drink, the toy slipped half from his coat. A sharp-eyed cowboy spotted it, smirked. A toy wagon ward you pushing 50 and still playing with toys. The crowd laughed. For them, anything strange was laughable, anything unknown, dangerous. Rumors leapt again. It's Bigfoot, all right. Brings trinkets to mock us. Monster knows how to make fools of men. Elias stayed silent, but bitterness rose in him. They saw only fear, not the comfort of loneliness eased. They saw only monster, not the mercy of a memory returned. That was the wound of the moment, a man cradling his past like a secret, only to feel the sting of his own kind's cold suspicion. Night came. Back on the porch, Elias set the toy wagon beside his wife's photograph. Moonlight washed over it, shining pale as a tear. He laid his palm on it and whispered, if someone held on to you all these years, why? Out of pity, or for something more. From the forest, the tapping returned. Slow, patient. Elias no longer trembled. He lifted his head, let the moonlight fill his face, and left the question hanging in the air. If it were you, if your past returned to you in the form of a battered childhood toy, would you take it as a warning or as a miracle? Part 4. Footprints in the fog. The morning had not yet broken when the forest sank beneath a blanket of fog thick as damp wool. Grass wet with dew chilled underfoot. Elias pulled on his heavy coat lantern in one hand, revolver in the other. The weak flame cast only a trembling circle of light glimmering across slick earth. The herd bawled restlessly inside the pen. Midnight's tail lashed ears pinned forward, eyes fixed on the timber beyond. Elias stepped past the fence, his heartbeat striking its own rhythm, mingling with the muffled hiss of insects drowned in the mist. And there, plain before him, pressed into the soft ground, was a footprint, enormous. Not the split hooves of cattle, not the cut of a boot sole. Deep, long, edges rounded as though some great hand had pressed down into the mud. Elias crouched, lowering the lantern close. He set his own palm into it, and his hand fit inside like a child's hand within a father's. He drew a slow breath. The air carried a tang metallic as iron. Somewhere on the wind was the fresh scent of torn sapwood. Truth lay naked at his feet. Something had been here. Heavy, alive, more real than legend. Elias followed the trail step by step, fog swallowing the path behind him. Branches brushed his shoulders, dripping cold. From the open prairie came the crack of a gun, distant hollow. Target practice, maybe. Or a hunter. But the sound reached deep into the trees, jolting Elias's nerves like a lash. The prints drew him down into a hollow. Some were sunken, leaving pools with 4 finger-like ridges, clear as day. Others dragged long as though the creature slid or shifted sideways. Elias swept his lantern wide. Every tree seemed to swell, breathing in the fog. A memory rushed him. Then the storm 2 nights past, cattle scattering rails, splitting the flash of otherworldly eyes through dust. The present and the past collided, and his chest hammered. Out here, night was full of shadows. But some shadows did not tell you whether to draw steel or bow your head and listen. A sudden gust tore through whipping fog into a pale sandstorm. Elias shielded his face, the lantern flaring almost snuffed. Ravens burst from the treetops' wings, thrashing their bodies, slicing the mist into shreds. The storm of wings and wind became a war drum roar. In the chaos, memory struck again. He was a boy clutching his wagon running through the woods as gunfire rattled from afar. The storm of his childhood, the panic in the herd, the towering shadow moving in the dust. All of it came back hammering his ribs. He stumbled, nearly falling to his knees. His revolver slipped caught just in time. His pulse-pounded breath clanging in his chest like brass horns in a marching band. That helpless trembling he had thought it long gone. But here it was again, the wound reopened. The fog thinned. Elias lifted his head. Ahead lay a clearing, damp earth gleaming. The footprints ended there. Beside them, bark stripped from a trunk resin bleeding fresh. And on the ground, set with careful weight, lay a splinter of wood aged splintered unmistakably, once part of a child's toy wagon. Elias swallowed hard. The sense of being watched pressed down on him. Not hostile, not savage, but deep, searching, an unseen gaze that chilled his back and clenched his throat all at once. He gripped the revolver tighter, then eased. One part of him screamed to flee. Another told him to stay to listen. For though he had not seen the eyes again, their presence felt familiar, like something known from long ago. By the time Elias returned to the porch, the fog was unraveling into silver morning sky. He set the splinter of wood beside the old wagon, his hand trembling as he let go. The cabin fell into silence, the only sound the thud of his heart, stubborn and unsteady. Elias stared toward the forest where the trail had vanished, and the invisible eyes still lingered. Why had the creature returned pieces of his past? Was it the mockery of a monster, or the message of a silent witness? And if it were you standing before those giant footprints leading into the fog, would you press on to seek the answer, or turn back to keep your safety? Part 5. The weight of judgment. By late afternoon, Raven's Crossing lay under a haze of red dust. The sun slid behind the mountains, casting long, jagged shadows from the street's timber posts. At the corner, the Dusty Horn Saloon roared with clinking glasses and chairs scraping across the floorboards. The door swung wide, spilling tobacco smoke and whiskey fumes into the fading light, mingling with a broken line of harmonica notes from the far corner. Elias stepped inside shoulders wrapped in a worn coat hat pulled low. He said nothing, yet eyes turned his way, half familiar, half hostile. In the west, a man who lived apart was like a crooked beam in a bridge. No one wanted to carry it, but everyone wanted to blame it. At the bar, a Hunter Rose voice booming like thunder. Last night heard it again, the knocking from the woods. Don't doubt it now. That thing's real. Bigfoot. If we don't strike first, it'll take cattle, take lives. A swell of voices followed. Glasses gripped tight, heads nodding. Too many eyes shifted toward Elias, waiting, demanding his word. Even the barkeep, usually silent, muttered aye. I heard heavy steps out by Ward's fence. Sounded like hammers on dirt. Now the room's weight turned full upon him. Elias sat still, his drink untouched hand resting lightly on the table. A young cowboy, one who'd mocked him before, snorted. Old Ward's used to it, I reckon. Maybe he keeps it around. Like a watchdog. Laughter broke loose. Not the kind that warms, but the kind that shoves a man further out. In their laughter, Elias heard only one truth, fear of the different sharpened into a weapon. The hunter slammed his palm on the bar. Tomorrow we ride guns hounds into the woods. We end it. From outside came the echo of target fire bullets punching the valley air, rattling the saloon walls as if to seal the vow. Elias stood, his chair clattered back, wood smacking the floor sharp. The noise cut the room's fever. He didn't shout, didn't argue, only let his low gravel voice carry, "You've never looked into its eyes." For a breath, silence. Then jeers crashed louder. Ward's protecting it, someone howled. Yeah, bet those monster eyes are real pretty, huh? Another sneered. Their stares drove into him like nails, pinning him against the wall. In that moment, Elias thought of nights in sandstorms, hands torn raw on fence wire cattle, scattering no one there to shoulder it with him. Yet here they were ready to condemn, never to share. That was the wound, the crushing weight of a whole town, building a wall of judgment and pushing him outside it. He didn't answer, just drew his hat low, lifted his full glass and set it back untouched. Then he walked out. Behind him the saloon roared again, plans for the hunt-swelling chairs, screeching gunfire echoing sharper down the street. The sky outside had gone deep violet. Wind slid through the row of buildings, lifting thin sheets of red dust. Elias stood on the steps, watching the prairie stretch into night. Above, the moon broke through torn clouds, casting its light like a burial shroud. Midnight waited tied at the post. The horse gave a soft nicker ears tuned toward the woods. Unlike the men inside, he neither laughed nor schemed. He simply listened, just as Elias did. Swinging into the saddle, Elias rode for home, leaving the shouts behind. The night poured across the plains, wind howling against ridges like war drums on the chase. He knew come morning the town would march with rifles, with fire dragging their fear into the trees and shaping it into violence. On the old porch, the wooden toy still lay under Moonlight's silvered pail. Elias sat beside it, his hand resting on its battered frame. His chest felt heavy, carved from stone, and he wondered not for the first time whether it was man who most easily became a monster whenever fear ruled their hearts. If it were you when the whole town calls for a hunt, but you alone have seen a glimmer of humanity in the creature's eyes, would you rise to defend it or fall silent and join the crowd? Part 6. The Moonlit. Meeting night spilled wide across the prairie, the moon pouring silver down the edge of the forest like a river of light. Tall grass rippled in the wind waves upon a phantom sea. Elias pulled the reins tight. Midnight halting at the edge of the field, breath steaming into the cold. Far off, the cattle murmured uneasily, stirred by something they could not name. The wind rolled from the trees, carrying scents, wet resin, upturned soil, and something else. Heavy, wild. Not predator, not prey. Elias laid his hand on the grip of his revolver. His boots left the porch, creaking boards falling silent as he stepped into damp grass. The tree line opened to a clearing lit in silver. There on the ground stretched a trail of massive prints. And at the end of that trail a figure stood, Bigfoot. It loomed taller than any man, fur-thick, gray-brown, catching the moonlight. It did not charge, did not roar. It only stood the air between them, a canyon, though only a few paces lay apart. Elias's heart hammered harder than in any storm when fences burst and cattle broke loose. Sweat slicked his skin, though the night cut cold. Behind him, midnight whinnied, softly pawing the ground, but not bolting. In his ears echoed the saloon's clamor. "We'll hunt it down." The town clamored for blood, yet here under the moon it was only Elias and the creature face to face. His hand tightened on the trigger. His chest pulled back. Was a bullet truly needed? Bigfoot shifted slow, and Elias saw the eyes, not savage, not hateful, but deep sorrowed, old as the forest eyes that carried memory. Those eyes pierced him. In them he recalled the day his wagon was lost, a boy fleeing rope, slipping toy, tumbling into leaves, never to return. Now those eyes seemed to say, "I kept it for you." Fear melted into trembling, not dread, but recognition. In those eyes, Elias saw no monster. He saw a witness, a keeper of memory. The weight of it pressed his chest tight. Then gunfire cracked from the direction of town. A single shot echoed across the plains. Bigfoot flinched, great shoulders twitching, but its gaze never left Elias. Midnight shrieked, stamping backward. Elias's mind filled with the vision of dawn, a mob with rifles, dogs, torches flooding the forest. They would never see these eyes. They would see only a target to destroy. His finger curled on the trigger, then eased off. His heart spoke first, and reason bowed to it. He shook his head, whispering hoarsely, "No, I won't be like them." And in that moment, every sandstorm, every jeer from town, every long night alone fell silent. Only this meeting remained honest and unguarded beneath the moon. Two sets of eyes, man and beast, held one another. Words were needless. Truth already lived in the space between. Bigfoot stepped back, slow, deliberate, as if placing choice in Elias's hands. In his chest, the question blazed sharper than ever. Would he return home and pretend nothing had passed, or would he rise against the hunt, waiting at dawn? The moon struck his coat pocket. There, heavy against his heart, lay the wooden toy, the relic of his boyhood, carried back to him by the very creature before him. Elias laid his hand upon it. It weighed more than the revolver in his grip. "And if it were you facing what others call a monster, yet seeing in its eyes the keeper of your childhood memory. Would you fire? Or lower your gun and listen. Part 7. Eye to eye. Night laid its silver shroud across the tree line. Elias stood only a few paces from Bigfoot. Moonlight spilled over the creature's furred face, catching threads of gray and silver until it looked draped in a cloak of light. The air pressed heavier than any sandstorm sweeping the plains. Midnight snorted hooves pawing at the earth, but held his ground. Elias drew in a long breath, and his heartbeat slowed, falling into rhythm with the deep, steady exhale of the being before him. In that moment, there was no divide of species, no line of man and beast, only two presences holding each other's gaze beneath the moon. A gunshot cracked far off across the flats, fading into the wind. The herd bawled in panic, bunching together, rails rattling, hooves clashing in a chorus of chaos. Elias turned toward the sound, then back. Bigfoot had not moved. Its eyes stayed fixed on him. No hate, no hunger, only a weight, as if carrying the long witness of forests, the coming of men, their axes, their fires, their guns. A strangling sadness welled in Elias's chest. Those eyes, he knew them. They were the eyes he saw each morning in his own mirror. Eyes of one who had lost more than he'd kept, yet still remained to bear witness. His hand slipped from the revolver. He lowered it slowly, moonlight glinting on his trembling knuckles. Bigfoot tilted its head, eyes wide, reflective, deep as a midnight lake. Wind swept through, carrying the acrid smoke of distant fires. The town was readying the hunt. Elias could almost hear the voices from the saloon, the laughter, the jeers. Yet in this silence, face to face beneath the moon, their noise felt smaller than dust. He whispered, "They call you monster, but in my eyes, you're not so different from me." Bigfoot gave no reply. None was needed. It took one step forward, not in menace, but in affirmation. It had heard. The moon burned bright enough for Elias to see both their breaths mingle, drifting into a single wisp of silver mist. His chest tightened, the same kind of tension he'd felt when driving panicked cattle in a storm. One wrong move, and all could be lost. But this wasn't cattle. This wasn't weather. This was an exchange of eyes. And in those eyes, he was no longer alone. In that piercing moment, Elias felt boyhood return. The wagon lost his mother's hands, once holding him, and his own sorrow reflected back. Understanding across the boundary of kind was no dream, it was here beneath the moon. Bigfoot stopped then. No further. No retreat. It only stood, its gaze locked on Elias, handing him the weight of choice. Elias's hand drifted to his coat pocket, where the toy wagon lay heavy against his chest. He understood now. Those eyes sought no blood, no bullet. They sought only to return memory silently. The suffocating tension ebbed, leaving something deeper. Elias let out his breath, nodded once slow. A covenant had been made without words under the pale witness of moonlight. And if you were Elias, eye to eye in that moment, would you heed the town's cry for a hunt, or trust in the fragile bridge of understanding that reached across species beneath the moon? Part 8. Memories Unsealed. The forest's edge still held the damp breath of night. Pine resin clung to the wind, faint as smoke from an old hearth. Elias stood motionless, one hand pressed to the coat pocket where the wooden wagon rested, the other lost in the deep gaze of the creature before him. From that gaze, memory loosened its lid, like an ancient chest, hinges groaning as they gave way. The wind swept from prairie into forest, then circled back from forest into prairie, carrying two worlds at once, red dust and rotted leaves. At their meeting place, Elias heard a music older than words, hoofbeats pounding dry earth saddle leather, creaking the broken strain of a harmonica drifting out of town, a rifle's crack rolling like thunder on a summer storm. All these sounds braided with moonlight, striking the tender chord within him, setting his heart to trembling like a string plucked by unseen fingers. We have met before. The thought drifted through him, thin as smoke. Not spoken, not in man's tongue, but told through scent, through breath, through the way the night itself stood still so truth could step forward. Elias's hand tightened on the wagon finger, brushing the scarred wheel round chipped, missing a piece of light like tonight's moon with its bitten edge. Far-off cattle bunched together. A bull crashed into the rails, and the sound carried through the mist to the forest's rim, the earth's signal in wood and iron. Elias felt his chest tilt with it, and memory, like a dust storm, long asleep, began to rise. He saw himself small again, lower than the wind. Autumn sunlight broke into shards scattered across the mottled ground. The boy, Elias, bareheaded, eyes bright as creek stones, tied a string to a wooden wagon and dragged it along the tree line. At town, men stared at his mother, their laughter cutting. A frontier woman ought to laugh louder than gunfire, but she did not. She only smiled softly. The noon sky turned gray in a breath. On the horizon, a dust coil rose, serpent shedding its skin. His father, high in the saddle with whip raised, shouted hard, gathering the herd. Hooves pounded, horns clashed the cattle's bodies, surging like surf. A shot cracked, not to kill, but to turn the tide. The sound was metallic, acrid, as sweat dried in the sun. The storm of sand swept in red, veiling the plains. Air thickened, pressing like a vast blanket, muffling every cry. The boy clutched the string. The wagon bumped and bounced behind, spinning wild. Then the shadow came. No roar, no stench of blood. Only the knowing that something vast like a living tree trunk stood unmoving in the storm's path. Elias turned. Through the dust, for the span of a blink, he saw them, eyes unblinking, deep as an ancient well fixed upon him through the veil of sand. Fear tore his grip loose. The string fell. The wagon rolled into brittle leaves, gone. He ran, heart hammering his throat, breath tearing his chest. Around him, cattle bawled, men cursed, the storm howled. His feet slid down the root hollow of an old cottonwood. He curled tight dust, streaking tears down his face. And then the shadow drew near. Slow. Heavy. A twig snapped small as a spoon dropped in a kitchen. The boy lifted his gaze. The eyes hovered at the hollow's edge. So close he could see in them something strange sorrow. Not the hunger of a predator. A sadness like the forest itself when winter drags too long. The boy fell still. Both waited. Silence thickened. The storm keened beyond. At last the shadow stepped back, gentle as if careful not to wake a child who had just stifled his sobs. When the storm eased and dust fell, Elias crawled out, searching for the wagon. But the earth had swallowed it whole. His father rode past, sweat darkening his shirt, barking, "Toys lost. Don't matter, stand up the herds, what counts?" His mother came after her hand, brushing his cheek. "I'll warm milk tonight. Don't be afraid." That night, lying on the dusty floor, the boy spoke to the moon. "If anyone finds it, bring it back, please." The moon gave no promise, but the forest had heard. Time flowed on like a drying creek, sometimes trickling, sometimes mute. Elias grew, learned to fire a gun straight, not a rope tight, read the wind on his skin. The herd still broke, the storms still came. The town still cast sidelong eyes on anyone who lived apart. In the saloon, the harmonica still slipped the same sour note, and each time it did, men roared with laughter as if gifted free whiskey. He married one autumn. His wife smiled soft like his mother. Together they gathered the wind inside their home-lit oil lamps, kept one wooden cup always waiting for the absent. Then winters came longer than needed. One of them took her from the porch forever. From then on, no one trimmed the lamp wick just right. The flame burned, uneven flaring and faltering smoke curling into the rafters like a lonely cloud adrift. Part 8. Memories Revealed. Moonlight lingered on the forest's edge, damp and heavy resin mingling with the night air like smoke from an old hearth. Elias stood still, hand pressed to the pocket where the wooden wagon rested, his eyes locked into the deep, fathomless gaze of the creature before him. And from those eyes, memory swung open like the lid of a long-forgotten chest groaning at its rusted hinges. The prairie wind pushed into the forest, and the forest wind spilled back onto the plains, carrying both worlds' red dust and the musk of rotting leaves. Between them, Elias heard a song without words, hooves drumming hard earth, saddle leather creaking the halting breath of a harmonica from town, a rifle's crack rolling like muffled thunder. The music laced itself into moonlight, striking the hidden chord in his chest until his heart quivered like a string plucked by unseen hands. We have met before. The thought drifted across him, not in words but in breath, in scent, in the stillness of night, making room for truth to step forward. His hand brushed the wagon's wheel inside his pocket, round chipped like tonight's moon with a piece bitten out. Rumors had circled town for weeks, louder, with each retelling footprints big as wash basins knocking on trees, shadows pacing the fence line. Each tale gathered more teeth, more claws, but Elias knew better. At the forest's rim, he'd found scratches fresh with sap, long hairs matted with dew, and once small offerings too deliberate to be chance. A knotted cord hung on a low branch, two stones set side by side like wagon wheels, a smooth, whittled stick. He had told no one, not from fear of laughter, from fear of breaking whatever fragile language silence was trying to speak. His fear and grief had slowly shifted into something nameless, a quiet longing that perhaps somewhere in this wide world another being still understood how to guard the little things men were so quick to discard. And then, on that moonlit night, the wagon returned, resting on his porch like a lost lamb finding its pen. Elias had lifted it, and now, facing those eyes, he knew where it had traveled these 40 years, sheltered in rock hollows, through winters tucked beneath leaves, through summers turned over after each storm, kept not by hands that knew letters, but by hands that knew how to preserve. When the moon reached its height, Bigfoot stepped back, not fleeing, only moving aside like a guide clearing a path. Between two pines, a narrow opening appeared, and Elias, led by something older than fear, followed. His boots fell into the creature's prints as a son's feet fall into his father's along the snow. Trembling, yet strangely sheltered. The forest opened to a hollow. Branches had been laid in a circle woven like a bird's nest. Inside were small things, a frayed cord, a glass marble chipped at the edge, a brass button fallen from some long-decayed coat, a smooth scrap of wood, the same kind of pine as his wagon. Elias knelt, hand trembling as he touched them, worthless in any market, unable to buy even a sack of flour. Yet here in the forest's heart, they were wholly an altar without inscription, honoring the forgotten pieces of human life. At the rim of the circle were claw marks etched in rhythm, 3 taps, pause, 1 tap, pause. Not the cadence of a hunter, more like a ritual, a reminder. Here memories are to be kept safe. Gunfire cracked in the distance. Elias flinched, but did not rise. Instead, he pulled a square of cloth from his pocket. An old saddle lining his wife had sewn edges, frayed, still faint with horse oil. He laid it beside the smooth pine scrap, a poor, clumsy offering from a man too long without someone to thank. Bigfoot stood beyond the ring of branches, eyes somehow lighter. The wind shifted. Below in the pasture, the herd quieted. Half the storm inside Elias stilled. When he returned to his porch, the moon was dipping west. He placed the wagon on the windowsill where dawn's honey light would fall upon it. Drawing his knife, he carefully retraced the first letter of his name, E, into the wood. The blade moved slowly, cautious not to scar the old grooves, as though writing a letter back to the boy he had once been. Inside, his wife's photograph caught the moonlight as if a hand had brushed dust from the glass. Elias pulled up a chair, sat across from the wagon in his memories. Outside, dogs barked faint from town, but the wind muffled them. Likely the men were gathering for their hunt. Guns would thunder, boots would trample, and they would shout the name of what they feared. Elias set both palms flat on the table. His pulse was steady. He understood now, not through logic, but through the secret life of the forest that had kept safe what men had let fall. Bigfoot had not returned a trinket in mockery. It had returned a fragment of life so Elias might find his way back to himself. He exhaled slowly, like a man banking a fire to let embers rest. He thought of morning, of hot coffee, of opening the door latch earlier than usual, letting the wind slip through the house without striking its head on walls. And in that gentle imagining, he heard it from the forest's edge, 3 taps, pause, 1 tap, pause. the answer to a letter written without words. Elias nodded. His lips shaped what his voice could not. Thank you. The prairie exhaled its last chill of night. On the table, the wagon rested like testimony, and in Elias's eyes there burned a new light one no lamp was needed to kindle. And if it were you, knowing that all these years some silent being had guarded a piece of your childhood, would you hide that truth for peace? Or speak it aloud so that others might learn to believe in what needs no bullet? Part 9. The whisper night slid down over the ranch, pale moonlight spilling across weathered boards. The wind drifted in from the prairie, gentle now, like the land breathing after a storm. Elias sat on the porch steps, back braced against a post, his rough hands cradling the wooden wagon. Its wheel turned softly in his palm, creaking like the faint sigh of memory itself. Out in the pasture, cattle shifted in their sleep hooves, knocking lightly against rails. From the town came a distant gunshot, hammering the night like a blacksmith's blow. Elias didn't flinch. He only raised his eyes to the moon, remembering the great gaze that had followed him through the trees. His throat tightened. At last, in a voice cracked and low, he asked the question he had carried for 40 years. You kept it for me, all this time. No answer came, only wind stirring along the porch, as though the old forest bowed its head in quiet assent. Through that whisper of wind, Elias heard again the shouts of long ago, his father driving horses through a dust storm, whips snapping at the air cattle pounding the ground in terror. Gunfire splitting the air calves, bawling for their mothers. All of it returned as a single chaotic song. He clutched the toy tighter. The wood was cold but achingly familiar. All the years of loneliness, all the years under the town's suspicion, he had believed his boyhood lost. Yet here it was, carried back, not by men, but by what they called a monster. The flood of feeling broke over him. Loneliness, once thought beyond healing, was patched by an unlooked-for gesture. He rose, pacing the porch wind, tossing the hem of his coat. Midnight thrust his head from the stall mane, shaking dark eyes, catching moonlight. The horse drew in a deep breath, as though it too could sense the burden lifting. Inside Elias, an old flame stirred. He realized he had always believed in something he'd never dared name. And tonight that faith had taken form. Unseen hands, wordless hearts, keeping safe what seemed lost forever. Out here where storms tore skin and guns were greetings, this truth belonged to no law of men. But it was truer than any judgment or treaty. Elias placed the wagon on the windowsill. Moonlight turned its scarred frame into a small beacon. He fetched his wife's photograph, set it beside it. One bore a love gone, the other, a memory returned. Together they filled the wooden room with more presence than it had known in years. He sat palms flat on the table while the night's chorus of insects hummed modest hymns. In that stillness he heard no laughter from the saloon, no suspicion from town. Only his heartbeat steady now, carrying a fragile but certain truth: the past had never abandoned him. Tears welled, but not from grief. This time they rose from return. When the wild roosters crowed far off, Elias remained on the porch. Dawn had not yet come, but he knew morning was near. Into the fog he whispered, "Thank you. I'll keep it." To the very end, he lifted his gaze. The moon had tipped west, paling at the horizon. In his chest was a certainty he was no longer alone. Faith had returned not through men, but through a gaze beyond species, through a hand that had kept memory safe. And if it were you, when the dark whispers back the most precious thing you'd thought forever lost, would you call it fate's cruel trick, or a gift teaching you how to begin again? Part 10. A Silent Promise. Moonlight spread thin as silver cloth across the tree line. Bigfoot stepped back one heavy stride at a time, its shoulders blotting out a slice of sky as it moved. Elias stood frozen on the porch arms, clutching the wooden wagon tight against his chest. The chipped wheel pressed into him, painful yet warm, like the grasp of an old friend's hand. From far off, the town's gunfire rattled, hunters testing their rifles against the night, believing each shot would scare the monster away. But to Elias, the sound was nothing but stones dropped into a dry well, echoing once then gone. What stirred him was the steady breath of the creature. the fading weight of its steps retreating into the trees. Then it paused, half a heartbeat, turned its face toward him. In its eyes lay a message deep and calm: I go, but what I've returned you must keep. When its shadow melted into the forest, Elias's chest broke open. He sank to the porch, clutching the little wagon against his heart. His breath tore ragged like nights spent wrestling panicked cattle in the midst of storm horns, crashing hooves, tearing his own voice, gone hoarse, holding the herd together. Tonight he realized he had been that stampeding beast, and it was not whip nor rope that steadied him. It was those eyes. Tears welled, not the weak tears of despair, but the sudden river after long drought. Elias pressed the toy harder to his chest, as if releasing it might lose it once more. 40 years his voice quivered. And you kept it whole for me. The night did not answer, but the forest wind slipped across the porch, cool and tender as a hand laid gently on his shoulder. Inside, the lantern flickered, reflecting against his wife's photograph. Elias set the wagon beside it. Two worlds, love once lost and memory restored, now rested together, completing him in a way neither could alone. In the distance, the town plotted their hunt, eyes narrowed, hearts hard, certain of their justice. Yet here, in the quiet of a weathered cabin, Elias felt the truer justice. A being beyond words had guarded his memory, while men had only mocked and hunted. The cattle bawled once, then settled. Midnight snorted softly, but no longer restless. The ranch exhaled into a stillness that was no longer lonely, but sheltering. Silence itself had changed. It was no longer an enemy, but a home. Elias stepped once more onto the porch. The moon hung low, painting pale silver across the boards. He pressed a hand to his chest where the wagon lay heavy. Maybe I'll never tell them, he whispered, his voice carried off by the wind. They wouldn't believe. But I promise, I'll live different. I won't wither alone anymore. The night heard. From deep in the trees came the familiar rhythm. 3 knocks, pause, 1 knock, pause. The answer to his vow. Elias closed his eyes, nodded, covenant sealed. No parchment, no blood. Only a man and a shadow binding each other in silence. The wound inside clenched and eased. No proclamation, no witness needed. He knew he had been saved from decay. At first, Crow Dawn bled over the eastern ridge mountains, ablaze with fire. Light spilled down, flooding the prairie gold. Elias stood at the window palm on the wagon. His mouth curled into a slow, cracked smile as true as rain on parched earth. Below, the cattle raised their heads, chewing calm. Midnight nickered mane, catching the new day's breeze. Elias's heart beat steady, no longer restless. He knew then solitude was broken. Faith had returned. From town came more gunfire, but this time Elias did not shiver. He had learned some truths need no proof, some promises, no words. And if it were you, when the world branded a creature a monster, yet it gifted you back your faith in silence, would you hold it close for life or let it slip to follow the crowd? The echo of dawn morning spilled across the prairie like fire kindling the world. Golden light poured through the cabin windows, washing over the dark wood boards worn smooth by years of storms and silence. Elias stood still, calloused hand setting the little wooden wagon upon the sill. Sunlight caught the chipped wheel, and for a moment it gleamed like a jewel long buried, finally found. His eyes softened. All the lonely years, the nights hunched by the fire, the suspicious glances cast from town, all of it felt rinsed clean in this new light. Memory was no longer a burden pressing on his chest, but a medicine, a whisper that said, "You are still alive, you are still seen, and it is never too late." Elias drew a deep breath. The morning air filled him earthgrass, faint smoke rising from distant homesteads. He laid his other hand upon his wife's photograph, letting past and present stand side by side. In that quiet instant, grief did not vanish, but it had been mended. Outside, the forest brightened under dawn. Elias knew Bigfoot had melted back into shadow, perhaps never to be seen again. The town would never believe, but he knew, and that was enough. There are memories we think forever lost, yet a stranger's hand may keep them safe to return when the heart most needs it. No one is ever too late to find faith again. If it were you, would you believe Bigfoot a monster or a keeper of memory? Share your thoughts below. And if you were the rancher, would you have stayed or ridden away into the wild? Let me know in the comments.